To get started with Vault Azure Auth, it is essential to understand the key concepts and best practices involved in the process. Vault Azure Auth is a method of authentication that allows users to access Azure resources using HashiCorp Vault. First, you need to configure Azure as an authentication method in Vault. This involves creating an Azure Authentication backend in Vault, which will be used to authenticate Azure users. You will need to provide the tenant ID, client ID, and client secret of your Azure application registration. Next, you need to configure the authentication backend to use the correct Azure tenant and subscription. This involves specifying the tenant ID and subscription ID in the authentication backend. Configuration. You can also configure the authentication backend to use a specific Azure resource group or location. Once the authentication backend is configured, you can start authenticating Azure users using Vault. This involves logging into Vault using the Azure Authentication method and providing the necessary credentials, such as the Azure username and password or an Azure Access token. It is also important to note that Vault Azure Auth supports multiple authentication methods, including username and password, client certificate, and managed identity. You can choose the authentication method that best fits your use case. In terms of best practices, it is recommended to use a service principal to authenticate to Azure, rather than a user account. This provides better security and scalability. You should also use a least privilege approach when assigning permissions to the service principal, to minimize the risk of unauthorized access to Azure resources. Additionally, you should use Vault policies to control access to Azure resources. This involves creating policies that define the permissions and access levels for different users and groups. You can also use Vault roles to manage access to Azure resources, which provides a more flexible and scalable way of managing access. By following these tips and best practices, you can effectively use Vault Azure Auth to manage access to your Azure resources. This provides a secure and scalable way of managing access, and helps to reduce the risk of unauthorized access to sensitive data.